It says preparing to live stream the meeting. It's working. I don't know what it was doing before.
Oh, it says this meeting is being live streamed on my
There you go.
Okay, so I'm just going to click got it. Hopefully I won't negate anything.
Preparing to live stream the meeting. It's working. I don't know what it was doing before.
Oh, it says this meeting is being live streamed on my
There you go.
Okay, so I'm just going to click got it. Hopefully I won't negate anything.
It's working. Okay, I have. Okay, so I'm hearing an echo going on here. Got it. Okay, I have. Okay, so I'm hearing an echo going on here.
How about me? Am I echoing?
Okay, I have. No, it's just me.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm hearing an echo. Why is it? I don't know why it's just me.
There's a huge delay. I'm watching it. It's a really long delay.
Okay, we got Chris watching it. He's saying it's a big delay.
Thank you, Chris.
I don't know why it's just me.
There's a huge delay.
Should she just go ahead and give her talk? He's saying there's a big delay.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah,
Okay, what we're going to do is we're not going to do any more talking. We're just going to go ahead and go. I'm going to start with the presentation. Okay, welcome to our live stream with author Carole Adrienne. And she received her BFA from Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia. She's organized an archive for Old St. Joseph's National Shrine, twice chaired Archives Week in Philadelphia, and has served on advisory panels for the Philadelphia Archdiocese Historical Research Center, the Mutter Museum Civil War Medicine exhibit, and its Spit Spreads Death, the 1918 flu epidemic exhibit. She's working on a documentary film series on Civil War medicine and lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We're happy to welcome you, Carole, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. This is pretty thrilling for somebody in the field. I am, as Tracy mentioned, a filmmaker, and I was working on my 4-part documentary series about Civil War medicine. Hopefully it'll be out at some point in 2025. But I spent more than 4 years with primary source documents, letters, diaries, period magazines, and publications to get a sense of what the story of Civil War medicine really was and from whence it sprang. So this is a pretty special thing. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to guess that a better portion of the audience is at least somewhat familiar with the phenomena of Civil War medicine, and some of you may not be. So I'm going to do a little crash course at the beginning. But as a filmmaker, working with cameras, when you turn them in different ways, point them in different ways, light them in different ways, you get different perspectives on the same thing. And one of the interesting things when I was writing my book was the perspective that I had gained from all these primary source materials that really were pretty surprising and ran differently than what was popular knowledge at the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to do a quick drive through of what Civil War medicine is about. And then I thought, since the museum is in Frederick, Maryland, very close to Washington, D.C., and that so much of the advancement of medicine at the time of the Civil War really had to go through Congress. It was pretty much government approved before these advancements and improvements were made. So I thought, let's turn the camera on what our government did to move this terrible, hideous nightmare of a situation into the light. So let's start with the Capitol. There we go. Okay. I'm back one. having, oh, excuse me for one, there we go. Okay. This is the United States Capitol building. The Capitol is our national stage, and Congress is intended to represent the voice of the American people. So in 1840, this is what the Capitol looked like. Our first president, George Washington, actually laid the cornerstone for this building in 1793, was exactly 230 years ago, this past September. So you can see the building has a familiar shape that's still part of that existing building, and it has the dome that's smaller than what we're used to seeing. Ooh. Oops. Sorry. The I'm sorry. Okay. By the time of the Civil War, the size of Congress had doubled because there were twice as many states in the Union as there had originally been. So now this image, which I believe is in the Senate chamber, and you can see it's getting tight in there, far more representatives and senators than there had been when the building was originally built. So things had to adjust for the larger government, really. So one thing that was consistent throughout the length of the Civil War was the rebuilding of the dome, that iconic structure that we're so used to seeing as representing the American government. Well, the reconstruction started in 1856 and it went until 1866. So construction went throughout the Civil War. And an architect was hired to enlarge the building and also to design a new dome to fill for this larger building. So Thomas Walter was the architect who was chosen for the Capitol expansion. And the dome was made and is still made. Here's his drawing. They're so beautiful, the architect's drawings. So it's made of cast iron and it weighs 8,909,200 pounds. The dome is hollow and it has a hidden staircase inside with exactly 365 steps. So the walls, we really just see the outer part, and you can see it has a clear story, almost like a church dome. And the cost of this dome in 1866 was $1,047,291. Now, in today's dollars, that really comes out to between $38 and $40 million. So that gives you an idea of where we were starting from. Well, now we are going to jump into this war, which produced 1 million casualties, American lives. No one expected this war to last as long as it did, or to be as incredibly deadly as it was. And we are going to talk about the two factors that made it so dangerous and so deadly. The technology of weapons is one of the primary factors here. Now, at the time the Civil War started, the most popular gun in America, rifle, was the Springfield smoothbore musket. Now, this gun had been popular for years. These rifles are also known as long guns or shoulder guns. And soldiers really were emotionally attached to them. It was a beautiful instrument. It had lovely wood. They kept them polished. So this weapon fired a ball. The ammunition was a musket ball. It looked like a fat marble. It was usually made out of lead, sometimes stone. It was wrapped in a piece of fabric and inserted into this barrel from the far end, jammed down there with a long tool called a ramrod. And that fabric was to keep it from bouncing off the sides of the barrel on its exit and making a very erratic travel path. So keep in mind, as we talk about this little crash course in causes, that this gun fired basically 1 round a minute. It took a while to load. And that the changes we're going to talk about took place within 2 to 3 years. This is technological advancement that goes crazy. Well, the ball in the middle is that musket ball, but a new ammunition came into use at the beginning of the Civil War. It was developed by a French army officer, Claude Etienne Minié. So these projectiles on either side of the musket ball, despite the fact that they're bullet shaped, are known as mini balls. The important part of this ammunition is those grooves at the bottom. They began to groove the inside of the rifle barrels so that when you put this ammunition in there, that it locked in. The grooves on the ball, on the mini ball, locked in with the new grooves on the inside of the rifles. It increased the speed, the trajectory, and the accuracy of the firing. It is pretty much accepted that most of the gunshot wounds in the Civil War, all 4 years, were caused by the mini ball. This was a wildly, divergently improved piece of ammunition. So now we have guns with rifled barrels. The Springfield Model 1861, the most popular rifle in the Civil War. More than 1 million of them actually were manufactured at the beginning of the war, so many that the manufacture had to be outsourced in part to England and Germany. So this gun could fire 1 to 3 rounds a minute. It really improved the efficiency of the weapon. Christopher Minor Spencer of Connecticut was an inventor, brilliant young man, and he created the first reliable repeating rifle. We're now getting into a much more familiar kind of weapon. So you see the Spencer rifles here. The one at the top is a carbine with a shorter barrel, and that was designed for use by the cavalry. It was much less awkward than the longer shoulder guns when you're on horseback. The repeating rifles could fire 20 rounds a minute. So we went from 1 round a minute to 3 to 20. So things are really heating up on those battlefields. That is when the Gatling gun appears. This gun is the great-great-grandfather of every assault rifle, of every AK-47, AR-15, every deadly weapon. This is the genesis. The Gatling gun had 6 rifle barrels attached to a metal cylinder that was cranked by hand. And as you can see, this thing was pretty easy to move around and aim. The Gatling gun could fire 200 rounds a minute. So from 1 to 3 to 20 to 200 rounds a minute, this changed the face of battle and of warfare. This was a monster of a weapon. One of the other surprising things about it was that the Gatling gun was invented by a medical doctor. This is Richard Jordan Gatling. He was a brilliant inventor, and he made a small fortune by creating mostly agricultural tools for planting. He really helped revolutionize farming in America with some of his creations. Well, Gatling, in his late 20s, contracted smallpox. He was one of the fortunate few who survived it. And when he recovered, he decided that he wanted to go to medical school. So he was accepted into medical school in Ohio, and he earned his MD degree. When the Civil War began, he saw all of these young men coming back from the army, broken bodies, amputations, horrible victims of diseases. He was so upset, and he invented the Gatling gun. And after the war, he explained his thinking. Let me just read his words to you. He said, "It occurred to me that if I could invent a machine, a gun, which could, by rapidity of fire, enable one man to do as much battle duty as 100, that it would, to a great extent, supersede the necessity of large armies, and consequently, exposure to battle and disease be greatly diminished. He was going to stop war with that weapon. The second part of what caused the horror were the diseases. So there were common ones, there were unusual ones. Of all the many diseases that destroyed lives during the Civil War, the only one for which there was a vaccine was smallpox. But thousands of people died from diarrhea and dysentery. Malaria seemed to float in and out of the armies, usually in the South. Measles and chickenpox, which were previously known as childhood diseases, were deadly, largely to young men who had grown up in the country without a lot of association. The kids from the city had been around more people and possibly developed more immunities. But it was noted that the young men from the country suffered and died more frequently from these diseases. So what did they have to deal with that? Well, the two main pharmaceuticals were quinine and opium. Now, quinine had been in use in South America for many, many years. It's made from the bark of the cinchona tree, and it was effective in dealing with many ailments of humans and of horses. So it was extremely valuable to Civil War medicine. The South really had a terrible struggle because once the North imposed that naval blockade, they no longer had access to quinine, really the number one drug for dealing with everything from malaria to measles. So the South spent a lot of time trying to synthesize it. And one Confederate doctor, Dr. Francis Porcher, was tasked with trying to find something in the flora of the South that could be distilled and somehow manipulated into a synthetic quinine. He worked for a year, assisted by his wife and his mother. He produced a 600-page volume detailing the effects. And you can imagine, I mean, in a year, there's not much time for clinical trials, but they were never able to really have something that was as effective as quinine. Now, opium, the painkiller, seemed to have been available in just about every over-the-counter medication. Opium was all over the place, and it created a lot of addicts during the Civil War. An untold number of veterans died in veterans' homes after the war from what they called old soldiers' disease, basically addiction. Now, things that they had that were helpful, they did have anesthesia. I know when I first started doing research, I kept running into things that said, oh, they used alcohol, they bit on bullets. But it turns out that really almost every surgery during the Civil War was done with the use and administration of anesthesia, either ether or chloroform. Now, both of these drugs had drawbacks. Ether is very flammable. And when you think about how many of these surgeons were performing surgery in tents made of wood and fabric by candlelight. So they had the occasional explosive reaction from ether. Now, chloroform was effective, but it also had the odd capacity to kill rather instantly. Now, I've read some things that said sometimes with a large inhalation of chloroform that it kind of freezes the heart. I'm not sure if that's the exact physiological explanation, but they had to be really careful with it. And both of these at the beginning of the war were administered by soaking a cloth with them and placing them over the patient's nose and mouth. Well, that gave the surgeons about a 9-minute window where the patient was fully unconscious. And the primary surgery performed during the Civil War was amputation. It sounds horrible, but it was the single most life-saving surgery that was performed. They learned a lot of things about it very quickly. They learned that at the point of amputation, they kept it far away from the heart. But 75% of the amputees survived, despite the fact that virtually every Civil War surgery was followed by hideous infections. It's pretty amazing that as many people survived as really did. Well, let's go back to Washington, because I think it really shows where the drama and the tragedy are just amplified. President Lincoln sent out a call for troops in 1861, and thousands of soldiers and thousands of volunteers showed up in the city, and this country was not prepared for a major military movement. So in a building, and here you see the new dome, that was designed and designated as the seat of American government, the Capitol was called into use as a barracks for at least 4,000 Union troops. So here you see New York troops who were quartered in the Capitol. This is, I believe this is the Senate chamber where they're living. Excuse me. And here is the 8th Massachusetts living in the rotunda. So this building has really done some amazing service. Well, Washington, D.C. became like a huge encampment, and troops were trained and drilled on the grounds of the Capitol. There was a lot of action going on. So thousands of men had to be fed. Well, the Capitol building came into use again as they installed a bakery in the basement. And over the course of the war, it is estimated that 5 million loaves of bread were produced by this bakery in the Capitol. Well, a lot of different government organizations were housed in the Capitol, and there was one which was extremely unhappy with the bakery. That was the Library of Congress, which was in the Capitol at the time, and they were really concerned about the smoke and the soot affecting the books. They said no one was happier than the Library of Congress when the bakery closed down towards the end of the war. So, what else was changing in Washington, D.C.? The first Battle of Bull Run in 1861, this is the first really big battle in the North in Manassas, Virginia. And after the battle ended, on that field were lying wounded 3,000 Union casualties and 2,000 Confederate casualties. Many of those wounded lay on that field for a week. There was no ambulance service. There was no plan for mass rescue and evacuation. It was a whole new game. When you look at this slide, think about this. This is the waiting room for the surgical suite. We've all seen those, and there are no magazines here. This scene was probably repeated all over the country in cities and towns. The aftermath of a battle where surgeries were carried out, where men waited by the thousands for medical attention. This is what it had come to. Well, Washington, D.C. had previously had one building known as a hospital. It was a 2-story brick building that really was used to house smallpox patients to contain the contagion. What were they going to do? I mean, it was just so sudden that there were these thousands of wounded, plus people getting sick. Well, they began to, it's called extemporizing buildings, public buildings, private buildings as hospitals. Now, this is a common thing that they got so good at it, they could turn a church into a hospital in less than a week. They would come in. Now, here you can see this was pretty common. They covered the pews with planks of wood and made a secondary floor. Then they could move in the beds, and usually overnight, these extemporized hospitals were filled with upwards of 100, 200 men. They took over public buildings. Here's the US Patent Office, which was used as a hospital really pretty much throughout the war. And fortunately, that was a pretty big building. They also called the Capitol into service again. And this is the Capitol Rotunda served as a hospital in 1862. Now, this painting, which is pretty contemporary, this is by Alan Cox, and this is from our Capitol today. You can see it there. But I think he worked from photographs, and from the original Civil War photographs I've seen, it looks to me like this was a pretty accurate depiction of how they had it set up as a hospital. Now, in October of 1862, they finally moved all the patients into hospital facilities outside of the city, and the rotunda was empty for a while. But it was a terrible situation in Washington as refugees flooded in. Thousands and thousands of freed or escaped slaves who were known by the ugly name of contraband, implying stolen goods. These people flooded into their country's capital for relief, for help, for medical care, for food and clothing. People with really less than nothing, seeking safety, turned up in the city, which was not prepared or able to house other people and had never expected them. This is a really tragic entry into the city. And the best they could do at the time, they set up, and this is an original Civil War photograph as in stereo, tents in the mud. This is a contraband camp. Later, there was a hospital known as the Contraband Hospital, pretty rough hewn, but that's where thousands of people slept and survived in this dreadful, dreadful period. It was a pretty desperate situation. And a lot of other things were changing at the time when they realized between the housing and feeding and supplying of clothing for tens of thousands of unexpected new residents in Washington, D.C. One thing, as we talked about with Bull Run, there were no ambulances. America did not have any kind of an ambulance system in the 1860s. And so the common practice was to use supply wagons. And again, this is an original supply wagon, very traditional. So pretty much they would bring supplies into the battlefields in these and then take them out filled with the wounded. And a lot of times wagons they were bringing in, they just dumped the supplies by the side of the road in order to create space to bring out these grievously wounded men. It was an awful, awful situation. And you can imagine that even riding in one of these was a pretty blinking uncomfortable situation. There's one thing I like to remind us all, including myself, of every so often, which is that here we're looking at a vehicle used as an ambulance during the Civil War. We are not talking about biblical times. We are not talking about the time of the pharaohs. We are talking about 160 years ago. That is 4 generations. This is a modern ambulance. In 160 years, here's how far we've come. And in the 2 years since this photograph was taken, they're probably even more streamlined now. This is the inside of one of today's ambulances. And that's where they were coming from. Well, Major Jonathan Letterman was a veteran Army doctor for many years. And he was appalled by the situation of all these wounded soldiers lying on battlefields, dying from lack of rescue and evacuation. He was pretty horrified. he had an idea, and his idea actually came from Napoleon's army. He was a fan of history, and an amazing student of history, Dr. Letterman. And he was very impressed by the work of Dr. Dominique Jean Larrey, later Baron Larrey, who was a physician surgeon in Napoleon's army. He fought the Napoleonic Wars. Well, Dr. Larrey had some very interesting theories. One was that it was extremely beneficial to get the wounded off a field of battle as quickly as possible. Not only did it help the victims, but it benefited the morale of the rest of the military to see that they were dealt with right away. And Dr. Larrey also thought there should be dedicated vehicles for the removal of the wounded. This is one of the sketches. This is not something that had occurred in America until this time. This vehicle was used for nothing else but rescue and evacuation. And I like this painting. There it is. There is the ambulance of the Napoleonic Wars designed by Baron Jean Larrey. Well, Dr. Letterman thought this is the way to go. We need dedicated vehicles that are designed for this purpose. So they began to produce them. If you look at the incredible volumes of the medical surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, there are dozens and dozens of sketches of all the different designs for ambulances that came into being. You can imagine these things were rushed into manufacturing. And then you begin to see Congress comes into action, and they publish an act to create an ambulance corps for all of the Union armies. So this is a picture that you never would have seen in 1861. This is an ambulance train. So presumably because they literally made dates for the battles. So they lined up the ambulances before the battle started. This is an ambulance train awaiting filling these vehicles with wounded men and getting them to help as soon as possible. Well, Dr. Larrey is often called the father of modern day ambulances, and Dr. Jonathan Letterman is also known as the father of military medicine in America. It was something that changed everything. I always think if in the 1860s, if you were crossing the main street in your city or town and you got run over by a horse and carriage, well, one, you really hope that somebody got word to your family to come scrape you up, because there was no system from the town or city to come get you. And if they got you home, you really hope that somebody in your family could stay there and take care of you through your convalescence. I mean, there was no system set up for that kind of care. It was a very, very different world. Well, this is somebody some of you may know. He is one of my favorite heroes of this particular period of time. This is Alexander Thomas Augusta, later Dr. Augusta, MD. Alexander Augusta was born in Freeborn in the state of Virginia, which had very strict literacy laws, or as I prefer to think of them as anti-literacy laws. If you were a person of color, the penalties for learning to read and write were extremely severe in some of the southern states, not only for the person of color who became literate, but for whoever taught them. It was a really vicious and hardline situation. So Alexander Augusta, as a child, somehow saw a doctor in action, but he knew that was for him. It was a vocation that just called to him, but he had no chance of learning to be a doctor without being literate. Well, as a young man, he moved to Baltimore, Maryland, where things were not as strict. and he worked as a barber, and he found some people to teach him under the table. Well, he was a super bright student. He became fully literate very quickly. It was something he'd been waiting for all his life, it seems like. And he began, once he was comfortably literate, he began to apply to medical schools, University of Pennsylvania and other ones. And uniformly, he was turned down owing to the color of his skin. So after a while, he married, and he and his wife went to Toronto, Canada, where people of color were more welcomed and respected than in the country from which they had come. And he was accepted into medical school there, where he spent 6 years. So he also opened a pharmacy in Toronto to support himself and his wife and pay for his medical education. When he graduated, the dean called him brilliant. He went into private practice, but then Dr. Augusta was called upon to become the head of the Toronto City Hospital. So you know he was no slouch. So he was working at that when the American Civil War broke out. Well, Dr. Augusta wrote a letter to President Lincoln, and he volunteered his services to the Union Army to serve the African American soldiers who were becoming a very large part of that military force. Well, first Washington said, yes, come. Then they said, no, don't. It went back and forth for months. But finally, he was commissioned as a major into the Union Army. When he retired, it was as a brevet lieutenant colonel. This man broke through more glass ceilings than almost anyone I've run across. And when you think about how he hammered his way through under the worst circumstances, it's pretty amazing. In 1862, Dr. Augusta, wearing his Union Army uniform, on an extremely rainy day, he was on a streetcar in Washington, D.C. And the whites in the car, he was trying to stay dry, so he was inside, and they were trying to force him out of the car onto the little platform outside or off the car completely in the rain. And he resisted, but they pushed him off. Well, he was furious. In a letter that he wrote to the newspapers, I just want to give you his words. He was asserting his right as a Union officer, and this is his quote, to wear the insignia of my office, and if I am either afraid or ashamed to wear them anywhere, I am not fit to hold my commission. He wrote a letter to President Lincoln decrying the situation. And that letter found its way to a Republican senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, who was equally infuriated. And Senator Sumner took it to Congress. And it took a little while, but by 1864, Congress passed legislation making it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race on public transportation in the city of Washington, D.C. So it was a little bit of a start. Anyway, his lifetime efforts on behalf of African Americans were astounding, and as were his achievements. Dr. Augusta became, after the war, the first African American head of an American hospital. He became the first African American member of the faculty of a university medical school at Howard University. He campaigned for equal pay for soldiers, regardless of race, and was successful. And when he died, he became the first African American officer to be interred at Arlington National Cemetery. Some other very interesting and unexpected people came into the field of Civil War medicine. We get the U.S. Army Medical Cadet Corps, and this was a group of medical students who were detailed to change dressings, carry stretchers, and assist physicians in any way they possibly could. So these young guys were between 18 and 23, and this was a really popular act of Congress early in the war. The act was entitled An Act for the Better Organization of the Military Establishment. So the Cadet Corps trained along with the doctors, because at the time of the Civil War, it is estimated that possibly 300 doctors in the entire country had ever witnessed surgery or seen a human gunshot wound. 300, maybe. That's North and South. Surgery was not a thing. So they trained along with the existing physicians. And as the war progressed, these young guys apparently made medical and surgical decisions and performed surgery themselves when things got crazy. So they were a pretty hale and hearty group, and they seem to have retained a gallows sense of humor. Perhaps it was the age, but one medical cadet, Edward Curtis, wrote a song. I won't sing it for you, but I'm just going to give you one verse. We're the medcads, gay and happy, summoned from our homes to save, by the surgeon's holy mission, wounded warriors from the grave. They really, when you think about everybody pitching in, this was a remarkable, remarkable example of it. So Congress had made all these things possible, these advances, and sometimes Congress gives a different kind of confirmation, an honor, reparation, a blessing, rather than a formal act. So some of the people who were most deeply affected by that were American women. At the beginning of the Civil War, or that period of time, there was what was called the sentimental domestic idea, that women were supposed to be prim and proper, obedient, and in the background. And something, very few jobs, as it were open to women. The only job you could have and maintain your respectability pretty much was teaching. Nursing as a profession did not exist in the United States, and it was considered in really bad form for women to be around intimate situations with men who were not members of their immediate family. You didn't go nurse strangers. That was not something that occurred. And there was one woman in England, you've probably heard her name, Florence Nightingale. Florence was a brilliant student. She had been given a remarkable education by her parents, and she was actually an amazing data analyst, an observer. She was a statistician. She had some really revolutionary ideas about healthcare, and she researched them. The people who really in Europe did nursing were the religious. Nuns and monks were the people who cared for the indigent, poor, and dying. It was part of their vocation, this nursing care. Well, Florence thought it should go beyond that. And when Britain entered the war in Crimea, she went as a volunteer. The first hospital building that she entered, she described it was a nightmare. The floors were covered with wounded men and ankle-deep, disgusting slop of blood and every other substance that could be she just was appalled, but she got right to work. She got beds in there. She got the patients off the floor, and she had the floors cleaned. She opened the windows and ventilated the place. She started to deliver food and medications on a schedule. And the Florence's hospital, the death rate dropped like the ball on New Year's Eve. It was a revolutionary moment in healthcare, really. She was serious. Well, when she went back to England, she began to train other women. And she started, London had the first Western nursing school, founded by Florence Nightingale. But nothing like that existed in America. It was just a vast, empty situation. Well, there was one group of women in America who had any experience or knowledge about nursing, and that was the Catholic nuns. Well, this was not a good moment for them because this was also a time of severe anti-Catholic sentiment in America. There was a group, an anti-immigration group, very large organization known as the Nativists and colloquially called the Know Nothings. And starting in the mid-1840s, they rioted and burned churches on the East Coast. In Philadelphia, where I am, they burned St. Michael's Church in the Kensington section of the city in 1844. They went to Vine Street, to St. Augustine's Church. They ransacked the library, put all the books in the middle of the street, and made a bonfire. Nuns were afraid to leave their convent in their habits. It was incredibly a hostile situation. However, President Lincoln, when the terrible battles began, nuns courageously put aside that discrimination and dared to come out on the battlefields and in the hospitals. And President Lincoln actually put out a call for them, and at least 12 different orders of sisters participated in nursing during the Civil War. These hated women were amazing because they would agree to treat blacks or whites. They would treat patients with known contagious diseases. They asked for very little for themselves, and they would work crazy long hours. And then an amazing phenomena occurred, which was that almost overnight, these hated women became beloved. This is an illustration from the war years. It's from Frank Leslie's Illustrator or Harper's Weekly, the two big national tabloids. And here on the lower left, you see a Catholic nun depicted in an angelic way as a healer. The soldiers loved them. They were so patient. They were always available, and they would deal with smallpox, with yellow fever, with terrible situations. It was a remarkable 180 that occurred with the nuns. Well, after the war, actually in the 1920s, Congress stepped in and they commissioned the Nuns of the Battlefield Monument. It's at the Cathedral of St. Matthew in Washington, D.C. It's very large. It's four-sided. And the sculptor was Jeremy Connor, who was Irish. And I just want to read you the inscription on this monument. They comforted the dying, nursed the wounded, carried hope to the imprisoned, gave in his name a drink of water to the thirsty. To the memory and in honor of the various orders of sisters who gave their services as nurses on battlefields and in hospitals during the Civil War, erected with the blessing of Congress. We believe that at least 20% of all the nuns in the country, between 600 and 800 women, served as nurses in the Civil War. Well, some extraordinary women showed up. This is the Medal of Honor, which we see for the first time in the Civil War. It's the nation's highest military award for courage and bravery. And it is given by the president in the name of Congress. So it is frequently known as the Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker was unusual in being a medical doctor. She came from Syracuse. She had some wild ideas. She was an activist to the nth degree. She served as a physician and surgeon during the Civil War. She was apparently served as a scout and a spy as well. She was an abolitionist. She later lobbied for women to be able to vote. She was a force to be reckoned with. And to this day, in the year 2023, she is the only woman ever to have been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Go, Dr. Walker. Here's another woman that you may know. And Harriet Tubman, we know her as the indefatigable shepherd of people, getting them to freedom in the North, saving people from enslavement. But she was also a major player in Civil War medicine. Harriet was born into slavery. She also served as a spy and a scout. She risked her life for the enslaved and for the Union. And she's someone who was very important to healthcare during the Civil War. She was a very gifted nurse, and she also had tremendous knowledge of herbal medicine, which she used to great effect. She was legendary for her ability to treat dysentery, which was very frequently fatal. And in 1865, after the end of the war, she was appointed matron of a hospital in Virginia for wounded Black soldiers. And well, many years after the war, Harriet, actually 34 years after she initially applied to the US government for a pension for her service as a nurse during the war. And she was turned down. This is, here she is in later years. And here is her original pension request. 34 years later, she was finally awarded a pension, but it was based on her husband, Nelson Davis's wartime service as a soldier. So she got a widow's pension. She did not get a nurse's pension at that point. She continued to try, but in 1899, she finally was awarded compensation for her nursing work with a compromise amount of $20 a month. She was never rewarded for her work as a spy and scout. But 20 years ago, in the year 2003, the US Congress approved an additional posthumous pension of $11,750 that was intended to make up for the lack of appropriate payments during her lifetime. And these compensatory amounts go to her national historic sites. I want to introduce you to another woman you may not know who really exemplified the courage and the compassion of Americans. I always think this is a period of time and an area. This is Americans at their best, or at our best. This is people facing unbelievable violence and horror. For 4 years, it just seemed like it was never going to let up. Those million casualties were very visible for everybody in the country. But sometimes Congress became able to respond to medical and humanitarian requests. So this is Annie Turner Wittenmeyer. She was a widow in Iowa, and she was a lifelong philanthropist and social reformer. When the Civil War started, she organized a Soldiers' Aid Society, and she visited army camps. She requested and delivered hospital supplies from individuals and organizations. She was a ball of fire, and she attached herself to the United States Christian Commission, which really was an outgrowth of the YMCA. She was very concerned with dietary needs of American soldiers, and she felt that a lot of them were sick and dying from malnutrition. So she began to develop diet kitchens for U.S. military hospitals. In the course of the war, Annie Wittenmeyer set up almost 100 diet kitchens in large military hospitals, and it really changed the face of convalescence for so many people. And the government took her seriously. And you can see on the left, I mean, they published her recipes. This was something that was incorporated into the medical care of the armies. She lobbied Congress for granting pensions to nurses who had served during the Civil War. And after the war, she shifted her attention to the thousands of orphans that the war created, children who had lost one or most likely both parents. So there was once the war ended, an unused army barracks in Davenport, Iowa. Well, she applied to the government for use of this barracks as an orphan's home in Iowa. And she contacted Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and they all knew her by then. And he responded to her requests, and he went to Congress requesting bed linens and pillows and other items for the comfort of the children in the orphan's home. And then in 1866, the Congress approved the transfer of the camp and its equipment to the Iowa Soldiers Orphans Association in perpetuity. I was so impressed by these people who did not give up on making life better, not just for the soldiers, but for the remnants of families after the Civil War. And I think it's a very beautiful thing to see the kind of behavior of our country, of our citizens throughout this hideous, hideous war, and the things that they changed and the things that got better, and they were able to deal with incorporating, well, to a large extent, not what we would necessarily hope today, but did incorporate women, African Americans, into the forces for good. They were appreciated for their contributions. It's quite a story, and it's a story about heroism. I hope you'll have the opportunity to read my book and feel that power that these people gave to the whole country, North and South, really. Amazing. It was Americans who displayed courage, compassion, and innovation and commitment. So I've loved talking to you. I'm so delighted to be here with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. What better place? And I would love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Well, we have a few, and thank you, Carole, for a fascinating topic here and a fascinating talk. And I would, again, I would encourage folks to read your book, Healing a Divided Nation. And I really think that I had said earlier to her that it covers so much of what we talk about here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It could almost be our textbook. We do have a couple of questions. First of all, I want to thank Frank and Bob for checking in with us. Thank you so much for listening. And we have a question here from Janice, who wants to know, in what Civil War battles, if any, were Gatling guns used?
Oh, I am a little stumped. Is there anybody in our audience who knows that list? I will be Googling like within the hour, but I don't know. I believe battles in Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York. I do not know for sure about other states. Anybody?
I think, if I recall, it was used a lot in the West. Usually, again, in the so-called Indian Wars. I know that it was a big thing.
Yes, the Indian Wars.
So definitely something to look up. We've got another question
for that. That's important. Thank you.
We've got a question here from Scott, and he wants to know, what was the chloroform supply available in the Confederacy? Were they able to produce it in the South?
The Confederacy really relied a lot on they would dodge the naval blockade. There was an awful lot of blockade running, which is how they got a lot of that. Chloroform was not something that Dr. Porcher or anybody else was able to synthesize. But what they did have, it was invented by a Confederate doctor, Dr. John Julian Chisholm. He developed a better way to administer the anesthesia. It's called the Chisholm inhaler. It looks like it's a little box with 2 straws coming out of it. The straws went into the nostrils, and the little box usually had a screen on top, so they could drop anesthesia into it and have it inhaled. Well, it saved using all that amount they had to dampen a cloth with. The Chisholm inhaler really saved the South's anesthesia. So they did have what chloroform they did have, and whatever ether they did have, they were able to administer much smaller amounts more effectively. And that Chisholm inhaler held on for quite a while. I think you guys have some in your collection, don't you?
We do. Yes, we do.
Yeah, so I saw no evidence that they found a greater supply anywhere, but plenty of evidence that they used a much lesser amount to great effect.
Great. All right. Well, Chris, any more questions for us?
No, that was all.
No more questions. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Carole. This was a fascinating study, and I would again encourage everybody to get a copy of your book. It is available on our website and our store, online store. It's our website is civilwarmed.org. And you can just click on store there, and you can go and get a copy of Carole's book through our store. We are going to have Carole featured again next year. We're having our Between the Lines book club, which was just started this year. We're going to start publishing a list of books that we've chosen for next year's reading, and Carole's book is on there. So we look forward to seeing her take part with our Between the Lines book club next year. And thanks everybody for tuning in, and we really appreciate it. Hope everybody has a wonderful day.